All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Lynn Pausic, and welcome to our webinar on visualizations. So this morning you have myself. I'm principal of Expero, and my background is in design, and my co-presenter.
I'm Huff. I'm a senior UX designer here at Expero. Also, similar background, Lynn, in design, worked on UX strategy as well.
All right. Just a quick little bit about us before we get into talking visualizations. So our focus as a firm, we're a UX firm, and our focus is on what we call complex software applications and websites. So this typically means software that usually has domain expert end users or enthusiast users who bring a lot of experience and expertise to bear on the technology. And these are some of the spaces that we play in. So a lot of enterprise software and some B2C, big data. We do mobile as well. We also get involved in innovation work. An example of our innovation work is on the left. That image there is a user interacting with a piece of software that runs on a large touchscreen. So think like drafting table style big touchscreen. You sit down and you use all 10 fingers and a stylus, mouse, and keyboard would be secondary. So that's a great example of one of our innovation services. The prototype there is about kind of the Internet of Things and being able to easily cruise through highly visual data and be able to do some very specific kind of interactions moving around the multi-dimensional world on the table. So in general, we do user experience design, strategy. We also do user research, user testing. We do research and deployment of UX pattern libraries. We do training all around the world and speaking. And we also do front-end implementation of our UIs. So we've been in business since 2003 as Expero, and we have lots of clients all over the world. This is just a small representation of our client base. And really quickly, this is how we think about user experience, and this is how we'll be referencing user experience in our discussion this morning. And that is, we like to think deeply about user experience. So if you take user experience and you expand it into all of these different discrete pieces that go into user experience, you get something that kind of looks like this. That top layer, labeled visual design, is often what people react to as being their user experience, what it looks like, and the layout and the colors and all that. But really, user experience requires, or the successful ones require much deeper thinking. On the bottom layer here, we have, understanding our user audience and what they need the technology to do, so the functionality or the usefulness. These base layers are really important, especially if you focus on anything of complexity, to being able to really understand the value that users are going to get out of your technology. And then as we traverse further up the stack, we start to talk about things like information architecture, interaction design patterns, detailed interactions, content and terminology, and then finally what it looks like on top. So it's very important that we address these base layers. That's where a lot of business problems actually get taken care of. So a lot of your business goals are teased out much lower level in the stack. You could spend a lot of time on usability, moving upward in the stack, to little benefit if you haven't addressed the base. And we're going to kind of reference these concepts as we go through our talk this morning on interactive visualizations. Okay, so let's get started. What we have for you today is kind of 5 best practices around visualization, and then we also have some very specific interaction patterns. So first and foremost, getting visualizations right is hard. And further compounding the problem is many very educated users don't understand how to interpret some pretty common visualizations. And you combine that with maybe we've not even picked the right visualization to present to them, that makes for a challenging situation. So it's hard to get it right. You can see in the background here we have an image of a multi-dimensional visualization, and someone has found a UI library with 3D,
yeah.
woo, even though it's not, necessarily 3D data necessary. So we're obscuring part of the view. It just makes it harder to read. So we will talk more about understanding your data. But if you're having trouble or challenged by visualizations, you're not alone. They are difficult to get right. So the first tip we want to talk about is before you start thinking about any particular visualization, it's important to understand how your data will be used. So visualizations can be very powerful. They can help us glean insights and trends and things that would otherwise be difficult to deduce from tabular data, like, say, an Excel spreadsheet, right? And if you pick the right one, it can be wonderful and very informative and very valuable to users. If you marry the wrong visualization with the data, then it can have the exact opposite effect, right?
Yeah, let me just chime in here.
Yeah.
So some of the things that we want to think about is when you mentioned is just trying to understand, what are your users going to try and learn from this visualization? How are they going to use it? And think about how are they going to consume it, and how are they going to share those learnings that they get? So, will you eventually need to embed or export and print? Depending on who you are in your role in creating the visualization, you may be developing an application that enables these types of views, or you are just enabling the technology that allows them to consume this content. So just understanding how the data and the visualization will actually be consumed is really important.
Yeah, and thinking about your users and all this, as Chad said. So, before you really consider any particular visualization, understanding what's important to them, just like you would any other piece of functionality that goes into your product or your website. Second thing to think about is what kind of data you actually have. So different kinds of data are explored and best exploited in different ways. And so it's really important to understand, once you know the user's goals, the kind of data you have available. Sometimes if we learn about our users' goals, we may change the nature of the data that we have available and the way that the data that we're capturing and exposing and whatever. So a real simple comparison would be, graph data versus relational data as different types of structures. And we could talk all week about graph theory, but we're not going to do that. But thinking about, the fundamentals of what kind of data you have and what's important. So, for example, if you had graph-based data, the things that would be really important there to get the value out of the data would be the relationships, right, and the semantic nature of the relationships, right? A very common example of this, it would be Facebook. So, wanting to know within a certain number of hops someone that is like me. So, who likes the same coffee shops that I do, right? So that's an example of a graphy kind of question that you might ask. And it assumes some value in the relationships of the data because it's saying, well, if I'm asking this question of my friends and some reasonable threshold around my friends, then I believe there's a certain integrity to the answers that I get back, right? Versus just asking a general question. So if you have relational data and users asking a lot of different kinds of ad hoc questions, then you want to think about taking advantage of those kinds of visualizations. We have an example here on the right. This is from a product called Lynn. We're in no way endorsing or not endorsing Lynn. It's a very cool little browser for looking at graphy type data and relationships. Versus, more often people tend to have relational data. So these are, the difference there would be saying something to the effect of, what coffee shop did people rate the highest in Austin in 2014? So the ability to perform similar queries over and over, right? not so much about the relationship and getting to the endpoint of that relationship every time in the data. But anyway, before you choose visualization, it's really important to understand the kind of data that you have and make sure that that structure is mapped to your user goals. Also, when you think about the kind of data, another attribute to consider is size. Do you have small data sets, larger data sets? How are they going to be delivered? If you want to have visualizations that respond between, from desktop to tablet to handset, what does that mean? How are you going to have to break it down for delivery? And the visualization that you deliver, for example, on the desktop may need to change a little on the handset depending on the size of your data.
Yeah, this is pretty common for us to come into when we're consulting with our clients, is understanding whether or not the data is going to be client side or server side, and technically it makes a big difference.
Yep, absolutely. All right. And then what's the state of your data? This can be another challenge. So there are a lot of great tools out there, a lot of different visualization libraries available. But if your backend isn't ready to talk to those visualizations, that's going to be a challenge, and you're going to need to do a whole lot of extra effort kind of making your logic stand on its head to do these communications between your presentation layer and your back end. So another thing to consider is the state of your data, right? If we have some spaghetti going on and things aren't surfaced in the best way, then you may want to think about getting your back end in order, to make it easier to be able to utilize a lot of the products that are available to plug and play with on the market. Okay, number 3. What's the best information display mechanism for your data? And now is when we start to talk about specific visualizations and some different patterns. So Chad, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll kind of explain this here. We've got a diagram that it's been inspired by another researcher, but that's really just helpful to explain some of the decision making you can make as you're looking at your data, and then trying to understand what the user need is, and then picking a visualization based on that. So, for example, if you want to compare a few items, it has a single variable, you may want to use a bar chart. It's simple, but it's great. If you want to see those same items but compare them over time, then consider a line chart, potentially a timeline. If you're looking at those same items but multiple variables, then it's looking at a scatter chart or a bubble chart if you're looking at 3 variables. So you can see how there's understanding what your data is, what you have, and what the user need is can guide you to the right type of display mechanism.
And this is really important. We see this a lot on projects where there's a disconnect between, the organization gets a license to, let's say, a tree map, but it's totally inappropriate for the kind of data that you're trying to display. So it's easy to get caught up in these visualizations that look great, and the demos are clearly very valuable, but when you apply them to your own data, that's not always necessarily the case. So keep in mind there's a whole world of different display mechanisms out there, and you really need to think about what your users are trying to achieve. And sometimes there's more than one that's applicable to any situation, right? You might want to give the user a choice. Okay, so now we're going to look at some common situations and controls that are particularly good for enterprise users. And the first one we're going to look at is tree maps. Tree maps are really good with hierarchical data that's fairly shallow, usually around 3 levels to the taxonomy, as we've illustrated here with this map of the market. So you can see we've got over here on the left, we've got 3 layers exposed here. We've got the Dow Jones, consumer goods, and Coca-Cola. And then over here on the right, you can see that visualized where we've got the map of the market, consumer goods is selected, and then specifically we've tuned into Coca-Cola. So we pretty easily have 3 levels represented. 4 is pushing it with a tree map. Beyond that, you need to be able to drill into your tree map if you're going to use a tree map and possibly expose another layer of information with a different visualization or perhaps another tree map. So if you have deep hierarchies, Tree maps are probably not for you.
Right.
You're going to want some other display mechanism.
Yeah.
Let me show you a little closer. I know, Chad, if you have anything to add.
No, and it's gonna. You can have deeper hierarchies, but then you have to have ways to control the number of levels that you want to display, and make sure that the data can then roll up to some sort of aggregate at each of those levels.
Yeah, and the good news is if a tree map is for you, there are lots of different libraries available that support tree map controls. And they can be really nice. You can allow end users to customize some key attributes. So for example, what does color represent? What does size represent? And they're great for that information at a glance. So tree maps really work at multiple levels. So at a glance, if I wanted to know in the market, roughly, which industries are doing well, assuming that green is good and red is bad, although the user can configure that, I can just get that at a glance information right away. I see something that pulls my eye, I can drill in and I can learn a little bit more quickly, which is nice. And this particular control, again, we're not advocating one control over another, but this particular control also has a tagging scheme that interplays on the right. So if you select one of the tags, then it will light up the corresponding, block on the tree map, which is also kind of nice. So you can imagine, rather than stock tickers in your software, you might have key terms or other kind of tagging-like mechanisms that then could interplay with your tree map. This is an example of why tree maps are lousy for deep hierarchies. It becomes overwhelming pretty quickly, and then you're in the business of pagination and expanding sections.
Yes. So you can tell there's probably 4 levels of hierarchy before you get to the child node in this case.
Yeah. Okay. So if you have geo-referenced data, some different things that you can do with geographic browsing. Of course, we can just have base maps and move around. I'm going to show you an example here today that's kind of a richer example of geo-referenced information. We've got several layers coming through. So at the base layer of our maps, we've got a geographic map. This one happens to be, I believe, of Boston. It's a geographic map. Yeah, I think it's Boston. And then over top of that, we've got a layer of information regarding crime incidents. And we've got a range of data being displayed from a low number to a high number. And that you can see that over here on the legend. So that's kind of layer 1. We've got geographic data, and then now we've overlaid the number of crime incidents, so we can very quickly, at a glance, start to learn about the hotspots, right? And then further, we can filter that. Their control allows for interacting, which is really nice, and we could say these are the different incidents that we want to be able to see. So that's going to impact our heat map that's been overlaid on top of the geographic map. And then further, we have a bubble chart that's been overlaid here with specific incidents. So if I clicked on, which I'm not going to do because it's PowerPoint, 104, then I would get a nice detailed version of what the 104 things were. And I can filter those by incident, etc. Further, this one is an interesting example of where now they've also mashed up, in addition to a more traditional georeference view, which is the map, they've also mashed up this bar chart, which allows you to explore trend-based information. You can explore by hour or by day relative to what you're seeing on the map. So it's a really nice example of if you have georeferenced data, being able to layer on information at a glance, allow the user to have some control over that. You can quickly take details away. You can also dive in to learn more and interplay with the map and to highlight the details that you care about. So key takeaway here is think about how to move beyond maybe just maps and symbols. If you have georeference data, think about what different types of information might be interesting to overlay. And also, Truly is a nice one if you haven't played with it, because you can actually go out there and play with it and see what it feels like, and they have controls available as well. So it's one of the reasons that we like to talk about Yeah, this one, so it's actually available to interact.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about temporal data. So if you are in the situation where browsing by time is important as a mechanism, that can be another way to think about visualizing your data. Chad, if you want to.
Yeah, so this is an example of looking at data that has enumerated values, ordinal values in this example, showing a life cycle phase on something called an application. And so you see a time control and be able to see multiple phases and see which phase a particular application is at a particular time. It's be able to make comparison across multiple applications in this example. Whereas I think that the next example we have of temporal browsing is looking at a chart with actual numeric values that you're used to seeing in financial charts for making that same type of comparison.
Yeah. Another thing that can be good about temporal browsing, if you have a lot of data, not even necessarily big data, but you have a lot of data and it can be challenging for the user to know where to look. Time can be one of those attributes that you can lean on as a way to be able to start to interact with your data. And there's a lot of controls available. Google has one, that's what we have here. And by time-based controls, I'm talking about kind of this area of the graph at the bottom where we get some nice chronology. In the case of IBM, you can see 30 plus years of time-based data that you can quickly, at a glance, look and see where you think it gets interesting for whatever your needs are. And so it can be really good for macro browsing as well. So if you, if you have a larger data set and you don't currently have time-related attributes, or status can be another good one for macro browsing, consider maybe adding that as an attribute on your back end, something you can start tracking and expose. It can be really good for visualizing your data. Okay. Another common situation, we've mentioned several times that it's really good to have your data work at multiple levels. This example is an award-winning dashboard in the pharmaceutical industry. We did not create this dashboard, someone sent it to us as an example. But users love this dashboard, and at first glance it might feel almost a little bit overwhelming, but then you start to look at it, and it has a lot of nice things going on. You can see why users like this dashboard. So it has a lot of information, yet it works at many levels. And one of the ways that it works at many levels is it offers information in line, and it's using visualizations like spark lines, and we've got tornado charts in here. But it's pairing them in proximity to other data, which really boosts their values. So they are pulling the user's eye, and then from there, the user can choose to go deeper, should they choose to do so. And then at the top, we have a more traditional kind of bar chart as well. But this displaying small visualizations in context can be very powerful. To help the user just quickly glean what's going on and then go deeper if they choose to do so.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great example.
Yeah. So, and it probably would not be a visualization webinar if Stephen Few wasn't mentioned at least once. We're not really talking about dashboards today, just visualizations. But we have Stephen Few to thank for many of our wonderful conventions that we rely on today on visualizations and dashboards. And one of the canonical examples that we credit him for is bullet charts. And they're a very handy visualization. We run into situations a lot where gauges are used, and that's an example where very seldom is a gauge the right information display mechanism. Typically, they're misappropriated and not supporting the data that we're really trying to represent. So let's not do that. Instead of gauges, a better choice for displaying a range of data against a series of target values would be a bullet chart. So just trust me that on the right, we have the same information displayed as we just had on the left in that dashboard. And what we have here is a list of sales reps, and then there's a corresponding color range next to each sales rep, excuse me, that has to do with performance. There's a bar imposed over the range, and that is the current performance, which was previously represented by the needle on the gauge. And then also now we can establish a quota line, which was really difficult to view in the gauge representation. So again, having the right information display mechanism for the job. Another benefit that we get out of this new representation is it's really easy to compare, right? Much more difficult to compare with the gauge representation. And yes, gauges are readily available in most UI toolkits, but bullet charts are very easy. If you're web-based, they're very easy to build out of CSS, and there are products that support them already off the shelf as well.
Yeah, and a common tip here too, kind of a bonus of this view is actually seeing the legend, being able to see what those values mean. Because oftentimes they just rely on color, but here it's the ability to label it is very clear. We'll get into that in a little bit more next.
Yeah, talk about labels in a minute. And there's more, a few additional considerations.
Yeah, so this is an example of combining visualization. So on the burn down chart is something you may have seen, where the remaining and completion task is very similar to the remaining effort hours. So you can combine those and have the same data plotted in the same chart and get to see the relationship between those different items.
Yeah. The key takeaway here is think about combining your visualizations. Now you have to do it in a meaningful way, right? But all of these are relatively simple visualizations on their own. They're bar charts, they're line graphs, things of that nature. And where visualizations appear, one place that they appear commonly is dashboards. Space is often very limited on a dashboard. So take a look at your dashboards or wherever your visualizations appear and think about if it would make sense to combine some of the visualizations, excuse me, in a meaningful way. Sometimes they become even more meaningful whenever you combine them, and they can definitely help with real estate. Okay. Another concept is co-visualizing. An example of this here, so this is a snapshot out of a tool where there's, this is an agile backlog, and then we're co-visualizing sprints over here on the right.
Yeah, so just being able to see the burn down and the health index on the right for the current sprint, this example is helpful for the user to, as they're planning for the next sprint, to be able to understand how things may be going, but have all the information at a glance.
Yeah. So in real life, if you're part of an agile team, you've probably watched your Scrum Master go back and forth between, pick your favorite backlog, your Rally, your Jira, or whatever. You probably watch them go back and forth between Excel spreadsheets and the backlog. And a lot of that is what they're attempting to do is co-visualize. They've got their favorite charts and graphs in Excel, and they're trying to co-visualize information. And this happens a lot with users. If you see your users going back and forth, between some other app, we don't want to reinvent the wheel here and do everything Excel does necessarily in our app. Sometimes there could be nice opportunities to co-visualize with one type of information, in this case, a visualization type of info, along with more list-based information.
Yeah, and another point here, surfacing data that's driving the visualization. So, as we pointed out here, many users are familiar moving from a spreadsheet to a report. So, they want to be able to see the data that's powering this report. Oftentimes, you may have someone that's questioning the data integrity or what's really driving this report. This example is showing kind of a dog-eared concept where you could imagine clicking that corner and then exposing the tree map data that's powering it. But this is something that we see as a need, whether you can access the data within the app or if you can export it and consume it in another way. It's a common need.
Yeah. and we get asked this all the time with this example. No, it does not need to look like a dog ear. The key thing here is to allow users somehow to access. It might even be through an export. Sometimes you have to put it back into Excel or wherever, whatever native environment makes most sense given the type of data that you have. But the key thing here is that the users have confidence in the data and that they feel comfortable fully utilizing it and sharing it. So if you're hoping that your visualization is something that the user could export, let's say, a screenshot of and use in SharePoint, many users, certainly domain expert end users, if they're going to feel confident about sharing a visualization in a meeting or whatever, they need to have that data to be able to back it up. So if someone asks, well, tell me everything that's in this red block here, and they don't have the interactive visualization present, they're in PowerPoint, they could reference that data and be able to describe exactly what was driving the visualization. Okay, number 4, help users understand the visualizations you're using. So hopefully you've done everything right. You've thought about the data you have, you've thought about your users' goals, and you've paired it with the right information display mechanism. The unfortunate thing for you is that a shocking number of business people don't really understand visualizations, certainly as they get more sophisticated. Many of us just, we didn't spend a lot of time studying how to interpret visualizations, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. And so that's a real challenge, even with the most expert of users.
Yeah, so and this is showing an example of an application where the user is actually fairly advanced, should be able to understand data, but there's kind of this process of selecting a content type and a visualization, and then setting up the parameters and then getting an output of a chart, a scatter plot in this example. There's several things that somebody has to go through. They have to understand their data, and they have to understand the attributes that would align with that scatter plot in this example. I think we cover that in the next slide. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about understanding your dimensions, and this is an example of a tool that's out there. I think it's called Raw. It's a web app that does a really good job in some areas, and in other areas it's falling short. But here it's telling you to map your dimensions, and it's giving you clear guidance on what you can drag. You can drag numbers or dates to the x-axis, and for size you can drag numbers. Labels can be strings or numbers or dates. So there's help there to understand what you can possibly do, so you're not trying to drag the wrong metric to the wrong type of dimension. So this is a great example of being able to kind of guide the user and let them know what they can do. Whereas where they fall short in the same exact example below, there's no labels on the axis. So if you've lost the reference to whether this was a production budget or the total domestic box office, you're not sure on the X or Y. So there's all these little details of it's really helpful here, but you've got to keep the help consistent and keep things labeled. Another example, kind of getting into the customizing date ranges and colors. So the use of color is really important in data visualization. Whether someone's assuming green is a good thing, red's a negative, and how data is interpreted through color is really important.
And where you can, allowing people, if it's technically feasible, to customize visualizations a little bit. Sometimes just the right label on an axis using terminology that resonates with that particular user audience, or colors that resonate with that particular user audience, right? Red and green can mean wildly different things in different industries, right? So a little bit of customization can go a long way between making them more valuable and less interpretation being required. Further, having help in context about the visualization itself can be very valuable. So if you're moving beyond the most basic of visualizations, don't assume that your users are going to be able to interpret them. That also doesn't mean that they're not valuable, but you want to make sure that you have help and context about them, explaining a bit about the nature of the visualization and the type of data, being represented.
Yeah, this is another example from raw where there's a great explanation of what the scatter plot can do and what it's being used for. In this moment, it's being shared as the user is evaluating the possible options, but the same concept can be used later on as you're just trying to understand what am I looking at.
So you can get very visual with your help and context as well. Okay. And the last thing, tip, is test visualizations with your users. And it's handy if they are going to be interactive visualizations, if they can already be somewhat interactive. If not, that's okay. You can actually still learn a lot from if you have a little prototype and you want to show some screenshots or wireframes. But it's really important to test them. And often, the questions that we want to ask around testing them may or may not be as obvious. They can be a little different in nature than typical usability testing questions. So more along the lines of, what does the user think they're seeing? So that's going to show, that's going to help to reveal, do they comprehend the visualization? And if you're doing this type of testing and you spot a trend that no one is comprehending it, that could be a sign that maybe you picked the wrong information display mechanism for the type of data being revealed if no one is understanding it, or perhaps maybe you did, but maybe the visualization is just off, maybe it's just not suited to that audience. But we want to get at the comprehension factor with visualizations. Then we want to understand what they want to do with them. So if we have a bunch of visualizations, say on a dashboard, what do they want to do with that stuff, right? Or if they're doing some analysis, they get a visualization, then what? Is it going to stay in the software? Are they going to want to share it? Are they going to want to collaborate on it? Are they going to want to export it? And then what's missing? What would make that visualization even more valuable? And so those are just some examples, but we highly encourage testing with visualizations as well. And this is going to be a future topic for us when we do some future webinars on user testing, is specifically about how you user test visualizations. So a little glance into the future of things that are coming if that's a topic that interests you. All right, thank you all very much. Have a great day.